Some of the infrastructure tools and utilities have changed with SUSE Linux Enterprise 15. So if we take a look, the two we're going to focus on are the inclusion of Chrony, which is a replacement for NTP-D, and Firewalld, which is a replacement for SUSE Firewall 2. Let's start with Chrony. Chrony has two pieces to it as a replacement for NTP-D. One of them is the daemon Chrony D, and that's what started at boot time. And the second is Chrony C, a command line tool for monitoring performance and tweaking and interacting and seeing what's really going on with your NTP protocol synchronization. To interact with it, we start the YAST NTP module, and we can set now and on boot, and we can specify, as you can see in this list, we can specify a host we want to communicate with. If we want to add one, we would simply click the Add button, add in the address or IP address. We can test to validate that it's doing what it's supposed to, and then we can verify that it works. Now, that's through the tool, but what if we want to do it from the command line? Easy enough to do. We edit the etcchrony.conf file. We add in server designations as we need to. We can even set a pool, which will allow it to resolve to whatever IP address is returned and synchronize based on that. Chrony can also be started from a shell from the command line, so systemctl space start space chrony-d.service, and of course you'll need to enable it if you would like it to start at boot or when you change to a different target or come back to the current target. Systemctl space enable. Now, once you have the service configured, and that's fairly simple to do, you can use Chrony C to change the behavior of Chrony D at runtime or to generate status reports. So Chrony C can be run either in an interactive or non-interactive mode. So interactive, you just type Chrony and Chrony C and hit enter, and then you give it the subcommand you'd like, activity or transactions. So we can see what's going on. Now Chrony C changes are temporary and are not written to the configuration file, and so they're lost the next time you reboot or restart the Chrony D daemon. Now we're going to look at the firewall. The firewall has been replaced. Now let's clarify that. IP tables hasn't been ripped out, which is actually what's performing most of the work here. We're just putting a different front-end manager for managing the rules that deploy how the kernel reacts to IP traffic as it comes into the system. SLE15 introduces Firewalld, which replaces SUSE Firewall 2, and it gives you two pieces. There's the YAST interface, which actually is a third-party module and is launched from within YAST. This means that the YAST command line interface and GUI tool for SUSE Firewall 2 are basically gone. You can still provide some common interfaces. There's a common interface in YAST for doing port openings if you need to. But largely that's been removed, and the Firewall-config tool is used to make those changes. You also have some changes based on AutoYAST. AutoYAST had to be updated because it was using SUSE Firewall 2 to do what it needed to do with firewalls, and now that section has been updated to work with with Firewalld instead of SUSE Firewall 2. So here's our interface for Firewalld, where we come in through a graphical tool called Firewall Config, and its job is to allow for the opening of ports, the designations of zones, whether masquerading and such things are allowed through. Those can all be managed through this interface. The interface is a little bit different than SUSE Firewall 2's interface. Specifically, the zones are defined differently, although they are relatively understandable without having to go into great detail to learn what they all mean. If you have experience with SUSE Firewall 2, you will find yourself comfortable with Firewall-D zones as well. So here we're selecting the proper zones. We could also go in and see these two changes, the use of what's called a configuration. We have a runtime configuration and a permanent configuration. Runtime is what is currently loaded into and being used to route traffic on this system. And the second is permanent. If I restart this machine, what rules will be applied? So permanent and runtime can be done differently and have to be done differently, because runtime is good for testing and to show you what's currently being done. Permanent are rules that will be applied when restarting the firewall. There's also the firewall-command tool. This is the command line tool for manipulating Firewall-D, and we can do things like make rules permanent by doing a -- permanent. If we don't, they're added into that runtime set of rules. You can push runtime rules to permanent if you need to with the runtime to permanent command. As a demonstration of the firewall-command tool, we can use it as displayed here to show us interfaces for a particular zone, that first example. Or we can see how to add an interface to a zone or change an interface to a different zone. Note that if you have an interface already assigned to a zone, you can't add it to another zone. You have to change it to the zone. If we look at other things we can do with the Firewall-D environment, it has the idea of what's called a service, which consists of ports that might be used and protocols, UDP or TCP and so forth. Those service definitions can be used for making the associated network functionality accessible in a zone very quickly by referencing the service like HTTP or SSH and so forth. We can also set masquerading from the command line by saying which zone we're doing masquerading for, or port forwarding, where we say when a port is requested on this port, send it to that machine over there on that port. Forwarding and masquerading, as you probably are already familiar with.